Hi, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where your location is. This is Steve Pearson, and I am the PwC practice leader for our capital planning and stress testing. I'm joined this morning by Charles Von Alten, who leads our model development efforts and really develops our thought leadership for our practice related to integrated strategic planning, budgeting, and stress testing. This morning, as we discuss, largely what we're thinking about is the pivot that we see banks making in recent years here now from a regulatory compliance focus, which was job one for many years, toward driving higher return on equity. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, banks were for many years putting much of their attention toward meeting regulatory expectations. But now that we're many years into the journey, not only is the industry capitalization more than doubled, and in fact, the Fed would say post-stress capital ratios are now higher than the pre-crisis, pre-stress capital ratios. But most banks are also now feeling very comfortable or fairly comfortable that they're meeting regulatory expectations. So the C-suite issue is very much focused on how do we increase or enhance ROE. And many of the banks that we're speaking to and we see in the news are looking for improvements in ROE of up to 5 percentage points of that into the mid to high teens over the long run. So it's a pretty significant shift. Now, when you juxtapose that with some of the quotes that I put up here, they seem to be saying that banks have never been more profitable. So why is this the big C-suite issue? And on the surface, it's true enough. Bank profitabilities are robust. Bottom lines are very good. But when you take the bottom line and you couple that with the huge increase in capital levels that the banks now hold, we asked ourselves, is that really the best way or the right way to be looking at the profitability? And surely, based on the C-suites talking about return on equity, we certainly think that there's a different lens here that one can look through. So when we looked at most of the largest banks, both U.S. and foreign, about the top 50, and when we put the lens of our return on equity versus the cost of equity capital that we calculated, the picture's not so clear. This graph that you see goes back to 2006. Now, and what we see now is that banks are still struggling to meet their cost of equity. Now, no one expects the banks to go back to the pre-crisis glory days where ROE really was goosed by excessive leverage. But banks do need to find a way to generate returns that beat the cost of equity consistently and hopefully by a wide margin. And at this point, it's more like a 50-50 as to whether banks are achieving those returns. And it varies a bit depending on business models. So what do we see? The banks that we see that are really making this pivot most successfully have been those that have invested in their stress testing infrastructure. So as we go through this presentation today, we're going to show some specific ways that leading banks are utilizing the data, the models, the business processes that they've developed to enhance returns to the bank. Now, of course, we can't share every idea on this call, but we're going to discuss automation, some integrated planning, and then a little bit more granular cost of funds optimization idea that we're working with clients on. The banks that are actually down this path are more than just merely compliant. And on this graph, what you see is on the left-hand side, mere compliant. That really just means that you're taking this as a regulatory exercise only. The middle is sort of good compliance, which is really where a lot of the banks are. In other words, they've made it more BAU, but they haven't necessarily all started to harvest the strategic benefits that they have. And so, the banks that are moving more to the right-hand scale are the ones who are actually achieving the better ROEs. And, we think that, look, the size of the prize here, when you really think about automating and doing this, there's probably a 50% reduction in process cycle time. It'll vary a little bit by bank, but it's something like a 50% reduction. The human capital costs are a little bit easier to measure, and we think it's about an 18% drop in the cost of the people time. But the big benefit, and what we're going to talk about more today, is around the data-driven and risk-informed strategic decision-making, because that's really what is going to goose the ROE more than anything, and it's certainly from our discussions with clients where they want to go. So before we get into it, we have a polling question, and you should see this now on your screen. And so the first polling question we have is, how would you characterize your firm's status on the integrated capital planning spectrum shown on the previous slide? Would you say mere compliance, good compliance, or full enterprise-wide capital planning and risk management? So as we wait for for you all to answer the question, we've gotten a number of questions, from our clients, and one of the key questions here that we get from clients that are looking to really embrace stress testing and make it BAU is that it's a real challenge. And so, I don't know, Charles, what would you say? What would you say is a key factor for firms that are making this a reality?
Well, I'd say business engagement and buy-in is probably number one. Firms that have engaged their business leaders, the business heads, business CEOs, in the development of, throughout the process are the ones who really, I think, are most successful in this. So if the front office is involved in risk ID, scenario design, model development, and selection, they're going to understand much better how the models function and their assumptions, limitations, and they're going to be more comfortable with them. And so what we find is when we've had that interaction throughout the process, that the businesses will tend to really embrace the models more, or at least be much more conversant with understanding their results. The other key factor is using the models both for stress testing and budgeting. The businesses are judged relative to their budget, so integrating these two processes is very important, and frankly will create an additional incentive on the part of the businesses to provide good feedback to the developers and ensure that some of the more nuanced aspects of their businesses are incorporated into the model.
Thanks, Charles. Let's see. We should have the polling results, and so we have 57% say good compliance, and another 21% say full enterprise-wide capital planning and risk management, with only 21% saying mere compliance. So that's good. We have an audience that right now that is, and maybe it makes sense because you're dialing into this and you want to see what can I do next, but it seems to be really embracing the stress testing and integration here. So that's great. Let's keep moving here, and one of the core elements necessary to harvest the benefits that we've outlined is a high degree of automation. Can you share some of your thoughts on the automation front?
So I think on automation, firms have been making a substantial amount of progress over the last number of years. I think overall, it's really probably the most important place to start when talking about integrating stress testing, budgeting, and strategic planning. because one, manual production processes are very costly, and automation is a big driver of efficiency. But also, it tends to be a condition precedent to be able to do a lot of the more advanced processes that we're going to talk about later with regards to integrating. So how can you better align some of the models and the outputs with how the business is actually run. So when we look at kind of the journey of automation here, we have a spectrum of levels of automation, and we think probably most firms are probably around the middle, maybe even a little right of the middle here. But I'll just walk through what we kind of mean here. So you have your basic level of macros and scripts, and I think most firms are well past that right now. We have robotic process automation, and I feel like RPA, people have a lot of different views as to what it is, but really it's about creating a automated process for a manual task, and it tends to be most applied where there are different systems that don't talk to each other well, where there's some level of human intervention in between. And we sometimes see that there's some combination of robotic process automation incorporated, as well as sort of a traditional process orchestration, which is more your traditional IT production system kind of world. When I think about the use cases for RPA, I think there are probably more traditional BAU use cases for RPA than in stress testing generally, but again, if you have systems that don't talk to each other well, this can be a good way to bridge that gap. Process orchestration, as I mentioned, is the traditional IT solution where you have defined data inputs, transformation processes, calculation engines, aggregation layers, and reporting layers. But then, the world that we're already moving to is the intelligent automation and autonomous intelligence world. And in this context, we actually get some very mixed reactions from clients on this. Some think that this is sort of years away, but in reality, much of this stuff is actually in place today. And so I want to talk about a few examples of use cases for intelligent automation that are in the market today. So one would be in the data cleaning processes. So you can use intelligent automation to look at what are your edit checks for certain kinds of data cleaning processes. And the AI can actually suggest additional edit checks for you. And in the intelligent automation, where it sort of differs from autonomous intelligence is it would suggest to you additional edit checks, and then a person would look at that and decide, does this make sense, sort of click approve and put it into production, whereas in the autonomous, that it would be more of an automated process. There wouldn't actually be that human intervention to approve the suggested changes. Some other examples of the intelligent automation being applied today is in data lineage. So there are tools in the market like Calibra that can actually read the code associated with various databases to understand what are the upstream systems that are feeding whatever database is being used for modeling or production or aggregation purposes. And so it'll automatically read that code and give you what your data lineage is, replacing what used to be very time-intensive manual review of lengthy code. Another example of this is in the documentation portion of things. I think talking to all clients, maintaining documentation is very costly and not something that anybody really wants to be doing, but of course it's necessary to have good up-to-date documentation for audit and regulatory purposes. But you can apply some forms of natural language processing to create some enhanced efficiencies in your documentation process. So if you have Gmail, for example, and you get an email, it might have some suggested responses at the bottom, like, yes, thank you, wonderful, whatever else. Similarly, in your smartphone, it will suggest the next word and whatnot. So this can be applied in model documentation as well. So things can be linked to, for example, statistical outputs. So to the extent that you have a new forecast, the AI can learn that all right, we're going to change this from volumes went down to volumes went up, and as well as volumes were down due to increased credit spreads, and volumes are up relative to the last cycle due to a less severe credit spread forecast. So that's kind of the level of documentation assist that we see as available in the near term. Again, the difference here would be between the intelligent automation and the autonomous intelligence would be that one is a prompted item, which I think still creates a very high degree of increased efficiency in the maintenance process, and the latter is more sort of an automated update.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think that, as you said, we get mixed reads from clients. This stuff is in place, but when you look outside of banking and you look at the rest of the stuff that's going on in our world, we seem to be very willing to accept autonomous intelligence when we put grandma in the car without a driver, but we're close to that, right? And many other things that we see, and yet when it comes to banking and data and stress testing, you do still see sometimes some resistance, but those things we do see it in place at clients, and I think it in the next 5 or 10 years, honestly, it's going to be the way that things are done. I'm quite sure.
Yeah, I think in the context of a highly regulated business like banking, there's always going to have to be some level of review of what any of these tools spit out. That being said, moving to just having to review something versus drafting it yourself is still a material time savings and efficiency gain.
Absolutely. So go to the next.
Here we have a functional data architecture for a production automation system, and while there are a fair number of boxes on this slide, you can kind of think generally about the process as falling into 3 main buckets: data sourcing, model execution, and then aggregation and reporting. So really the hardest part that we see is in the data sourcing side of things. Quite a few of our clients do a pretty good job once the data is in the system of then click and go on their models, having them run across scenarios and being able to then aggregate those results in a reasonably efficient manner. Where we see, I think, the larger pain points is the automation of the data inputs, as well as direct linkage of the outputs to defined reports. So, on the data sourcing side of things, really it's about making the IT investment today. And at the end of the day, without this level of automation, you're never going to be fully successful. And another component I'll just note on this is the maintenance of those systems is also an important component, and having rules around what do you do when data changes, is restated, etc. It's a very important part think through as you're automating that input process. Because if you have just those second and third downstream processes automated, those static data inputs, you might not have noticed that issue quite as much. The other thing I would note is the integration to the visual reporting and analytics. This is the other place where we really see firms now starting to embrace this. So for your review and challenge processes, whether it's for budget or for stress testing, being able to link outputs to defined reports and tools like Tableau or Spotfire is incredibly valuable and drives a huge level of efficiency in your production processes. So if you can, repurpose people from making PowerPoint decks, from, like outputting things from a model execution engine to a CSV file, and then somehow getting that into a PowerPoint is an enormous waste of time.
So it takes some investment, but then it puts the information right at the fingertips of the executives. They can see it on their iPad. They can see it wherever they are, and double click into it, and really then have information that's like timely and much more user friendly for decision making, right?
That live linkage that the Tableaus of the world give you to the underlying output is so valuable. As you go, especially to senior executives, right, where you're boiling down the information much more, and then questions come up about greater detail, and then you can just sort of click down to the underlying data and answer questions live. Currently, at a lot of our clients for senior management, senior management does not want a 70-page deck, but the people giving the presentation do want that deck because they want to be able to answer every question they might answer. So there ends up being, this immense amount of effort put into creating, an appendix or whatever else that, most of those slides will never actually be used. Whereas, if you've got sort of the Tableau kind of setup, you don't need to produce that stuff. You can actually go into the data live and answer many of those questions.
Right. So it's just there.
Yeah.
It's just there for you to click on and get the answers that you need without having to spend a lot of time on production. And that's why the production cycle can be brought down so significantly in our estimate before.
So I think we should move to our next polling question. Our stress testing capabilities and infrastructure are A, mostly manual and very time-consuming, B, partially automated but still very time-consuming, C, mostly automated and not a huge burden, D, fully automated, we just push a button.
Okay, so now as we're waiting for the responses on this, we've talked a lot about the automation here. We're going to get into in the next couple of sections. We're going to get into for some of you, the automation piece and emerging technology is the interesting part. For some of the audience, we think that how I actually use this information, some practical examples, is going to be the fun part. And so that's what we're going to turn to next. We'll get into a little bit of how you might use sort of the stress outputs and the baseline outputs from your stress testing infrastructure into your planning and all that. As Charles mentioned, it works a lot better when the business has been engaged throughout. So just going to give it another 10 seconds or so to see what the results are. And let's see here if we have some results. So looks like we said about 31% are mostly manual, whereas 61% are partially automated but still very time consuming, and only less than 8% are mostly automated and not a huge burden. And that actually is very much what we would expect to see, given where we know clients are. So I'm not surprised at that. What it means is that the majority of clients have started down this automation path, but that the majority of them also still have a good way to go. It's certainly a hot topic, that we think will continue. So let's keep moving here. Now, as financial institutions have, we want to get to the higher ROEs that we talked about. One example of that would be, how you really may use it for integrated planning. Now, I'll let Charles go into it into an example in some detail. It's not just preface it with say it's not the only way to use this stuff. It's a way, because we want to just give a couple of really good examples of how we're seeing it used in the market. But of course, there's other interesting things that one can do, and happy to talk at some other time, but not in this hour. We're not going to get to all of it. But Charles, why don't we walk through then something, an example of the integrated strategic planning and budgeting and stress testing.
Okay. Yes, thank you. So we're going to walk through this approach, which we kind of refer to as the playbook approach. And essentially the idea here is to improve ROE by more efficiently allocating capital and balance sheet. And this overall has basically 3 steps. The first is to enhance your revenue and balance sheet models to better incorporate firm strategy. So the idea here is that a lot of the stress testing models, their primary inputs are merely market and macroeconomic factors, because that was the exercise of the regulatory-driven stress testing. But for some businesses, folks may have already incorporated more levers in management's control, but by and large, many of these models are primarily macro-driven rather than business strategy-driven. The second is to do some scenario analysis. So we want to move beyond just sort of base and stress scenarios and start thinking about what are consensus market outlooks and what are off-consensus market outlooks that are also considered probable, and start evaluating our business performance under a range of likely considered scenarios. And this is, as you can tell from this is part of why we were saying that the automation is so key, because as you're introducing more and more scenarios from a burden standpoint, in production, really the automation is key to be able to do this in an efficient manner. And then lastly, the third step is to reallocate balance sheet based on your analysis of the ROE of different businesses under a range of likely considered scenarios.
Yeah, and so when you think about it too, when the business is trying to make real decisions, this can't be the type of information that is turned around in weeks or months, and it needs to be in hours or days, right? It needs to be quick, which is, plays to the automation idea.
Yeah. So, as we think about enhancing the models of today to be better purpose for strategic planning and reduce the level of adjustments that may be needed to align model output and base forecasts. We've been thinking about a few kinds of ways of doing that here, and there are many, but we're going to just focus on these 6 for now that are sort of, I think, readily in management control, and there's a clear path to incorporation into some of the models. So the first would be things like headcount, so hiring plans. To the extent that you're going to hire additional sales folks in a lending business or a trading business, what's the level of impact that you expect that to have on your level of originations or your market share of trading volume? So these are things that management genuinely has a pretty good handle on. They can decide that we're going to hire 15 more people in this business, or we're going to reduce the headcount in that business. And these are definitely important levers to be considered, especially in budgeting. And we find, as we've been looking to implement some of these across a number of our clients, that we can actually get some pretty strong relationships here between headcount and productivity, things like market share. So, for example, MD headcount in M&A advisory across clients tends to be a very good predictor of their level of market share. Similarly, things like catalyst hires. So, to the extent that your firm is looking to hire, like a rainmaker, you can look at the distribution of productivity of senior people in your business and create tiers of levels of productivity in order to estimate what's a reasonable level of impact we expect this person to have, like based on our historical hiring patterns. And this can be also incorporated into your modeled forecasts, and as a reflection directly, to measures of productivity in terms of revenue or market share as applicable. The third item here is cross-selling, and this is, I think, one of the most important. So the state of the industry today, I'd say, is there is limited incorporation of cross-selling. Certainly not none. There's definitely some. But the level of cross-selling that tends to be incorporated in the modeling, I think, is moderate compared to the business intuition of the level of cross-selling in the businesses. So the models tend to be fairly independent of each other. And there are good reasons for that, right? From an implementation, production standpoint, introducing the interdependencies creates some operational difficulties. Sometimes you actually also have some issues with model validation and their concerns about nested model risks, so essentially inheriting the limitations of an upstream model. But we think that the benefits of this from a business planning standpoint far outweigh any of those sort of more operational concerns, because as you think about how the business is run, these cross-selling impacts tend to be really important, and they're applicable across retail, commercial banking, sales and trading, wealth management. There's a reason these businesses are all held together. So some examples of this would be things like your level of relationship lending. How does that impact your investment banking market share, for example? In the retail banking context, to what extent are the level of deposits you hold and your level of mortgage originations correlated with each other? Do you have programs in place that are designed to incentivize that? So if, for example, there are companies that give discounts on mortgages if you carry a deposit balance above a certain level. These are things that can be incorporated into modeling structure. On the sales and trading side, there could be linkages between things like investment banking activity and some of the interest rate derivatives and foreign exchange. So, for example, debt underwriting. So, what proportion of interest rate swaps actually comes from debt underwriting? So, if you underwrite a bond for a client, will they buy an interest rate swap on the back of it? That's very common. We see that that's actually a material portion of some of these swaps businesses' revenue. Similarly, if there's a cross-border M&A deal, like is the client going to buy an FX swap on the back of that? So these are all interdependencies, and as we look at the correlations between some of these businesses, not all of them will be borne out in the data of any individual firm, but we've actually been seeing that we've gotten fairly strong results, generally backing the business intuition, but certainly with some exceptions.
But when we think about this, and we talk about integrating, you mentioned before about integrating budgeting and with the forecast. If the business is going to buy into this, right, it's got to reflect how they think about the business, right? And that's so this becomes a really key aspect to making that integration happen, right?
Yeah, because if you don't build in some of these linkages and you go to sort of an automated view of what's ROE for your business, it's going to tell you relationship lending makes very little money or maybe even loses money.
Yeah.
But you go talk to anybody in any investment bank, they'll tell you we have to have the relationship business to have the M&A underwriting, the debt underwriting. They're looking at the ROE at a client level as a BAU purpose, right? They have to be part of the bank group for the lending to be in rotation for the underwriting activities.
Right.
And so if you don't have this kind of a linkage, you're going to end up with nonsensical results when you go to kind of evaluate relative ROEs.
Yeah. So I think those are some good examples. There are probably, if there's a few more, I don't know if you want to hit on them quickly or if we want to move to the next.
Yeah, I would just note that for operational enhancements can be things like increasing and netting capacities has been huge. Revenue impacts of balance sheet allocation, we've talked about a little bit in terms of relationship lending similarly. And then risk appetite as well is something that can be considered with regards to should the distribution of your new originations, for example, in a lending business, be driving towards a level of risk appetite that management has set forth. So, if you're running significantly below those risk appetite limits, it can give you a view as to what would be the distribution of credit quality that we would originate if we wanted to operate at the ragged edge of our limits. In terms of the next couple of steps here, the second is to generate the scenarios based off the categories of variables, and then run your enhanced models and calculate your ROE by each one of your businesses. And then lastly, to evaluate those results. And this isn't going to tell you necessarily what the right answer is. It's going to give you information about what's your ROE in different states of the world to facilitate a senior management review of where they want their balance sheet to be. So if we go to slide 16 in terms of the scenario analysis, what we kind of show here is an example where they're kind of developing 9 scenarios. So we have a consensus scenario, and then some off-consensus scenarios, and then some other scenarios representing different stages in the market and macroeconomic cycle. And so the idea here is that management would have a view as to if market conditions were to change unexpectedly and move to a different stage in the cycle than even a consensus or off-consensus view would indicate, they would already have at their fingertips what's my relative ROE by business in each one of those scenarios. So if the world changes in an unexpected way, you already have something on the shelf that tells you, like in this state of the world, business A ROE, is down 5% and business B is up 2%, and then you can start reallocating your balance sheet and capital accordingly.
And one of the key things there is that all of these scenarios are highly plausible. They're sort of more near the money, so to speak, rather than just focusing on sort of your own baseline and then the most draconian scenario that you can come up with. They're actually fairly reasonable scenarios that one might envision occurring over the next sort of 12 to 24 months, right?
Exactly, and that's really the value there, right? That you're not tying this to a single scenario in terms of your ROE analysis. You're still looking at a distribution of outcomes because market forecasting is inherently imprecise. This ability to evaluate a distribution of likely outcomes, I think, really increases the quality of the information management has in deciding how to allocate their balance sheet. And so, next here we simply have an example of kind of a dashboard view of what this might look like. So, you've got two businesses here that have disparate impacts from the expected level or from consensus market forecasts. And again, the idea here is, this kind of gives you a pretty good idea of directionally, should you increase sheet for one business versus another. But the goal here is to just give that sort of directional information, not necessarily to tell you, like precisely the dollar amounts that should be moved from one to another.
Yeah, so it could result in immediate shifts. It could also result in, as the business leaders are seeing or perceiving a shift in the market, that they start to make the shift because they already know where they would want to go for under the various scenarios, right? So it's again more informed and timely decision making.
Yeah.
So maybe now we go to the next polling question. So our strategic planning, budgeting, and stress testing processes are not integrated, and we are not interested in integrating. Not integrated, but we are planning to integrate. Partially integrated, or fully integrated. So, again, is your strategic planning and budgeting integrated with the sort of output of your baseline stress testing and how or the stress scenarios? How integrated is that? So, one of the while we're waiting for the feedback from the audience, one of the challenges that we've seen, and we're actually, if anybody, if you want to put in questions, by the way, feel free. We'll try to answer them now or at the end. But one of the biggest obstacles that we've seen at several of our clients in terms of integrating their stress forecasting and budgeting is that they can sometimes be done at a very different level of granularity, both in terms of the number of segments as well as the level of detail in the budget. So some of the things that Charles was just talking about, hopefully bring that much more closely together. But the firms that have been successful really have a much more one-to-one relationship between your baseline forecasts and your budgets. It makes a huge difference because it requires a lot less change in your organization in terms of the process to get it done. The other obstacle that we often see is that if some firms have created models for a U.S. regulatory regime, and I'm really thinking on the foreign banks in some cases, but they're at the group level they may have a different process and for stress testing and budgeting, and so therefore harmonizing these efforts is a challenge to say the least. But we do think that that will change over the next several years, especially as competitive position of banks that have better information are outperforming. So, it should become a business imperative. Let's see here the results. Oh, where'd the results go? All results. Oh, there we go. So we seem to have the preponderance of folks on this call are either planning to integrate or partially integrated, with very few. Only 14% are saying not integrated and not interested in integrating, which is interesting. But about over 85% are either partially done that already or are planning to. So again, that's the direction that we certainly see the industry going. Leaders have already sort of made it down that path, quite a bit. So let's keep moving here. So we went through sort of like a high level, view on integration there. Let's talk a little bit about now a little bit more granular effort that we see also coming out of the modeling efforts, and that's cost of funds optimization and how that works, in terms of thinking about that while maintaining the various ratios that one needs to keep, in mind as they think about their funding mix. So, Charles, you want to walk us through the cost of funds?
Absolutely. So I feel like funding optimization tools it tends to be perceived as something that's really hard to do, but in reality, it's actually fairly achievable. If you kind of break down your funding process, it's really about the sources and the rates and applying those rates, and making sure that those sources, when aggregated together, meet your liquidity needs from a internal liquidity stress testing, liquidity coverage ratio, net stable funding ratio kind of view. And so from one of the things we've been thinking about is how can firms have a systematic and repeatable way to evaluate their funding profile in light of their liquidity target ratios. So essentially, it gives you a way to evaluate to what extent are you carrying excess liquidity and how much is that excess liquidity costing you. So the process here basically falls into 5 main steps. So one, you have to forecast the balance sheet to some extent. So we're essentially saying here, we're going to look at your forecast balance sheet, and then we're going to figure out how to fund it for the most part. And there is some interaction on the deposit side, but for the most part, that's how we're thinking about it. And then you're going to run a simulation engine for different liquidity mixes. So you're going to try, many permutations of different mixes of deposits, secured funding, unsecured funding, and equity would generally hold constant. But then also, what's the mix within those first 3 categories? And then calculate your liquidity ratios for each one of those scenarios. So when you apply your LST or your liquidity stress testing assumptions, when you apply the LCR rules, when you apply the NSFR rules, what are your ratios? And then you can select the subset of those that meet your target levels, right? So whatever, your target levels are likely above reg minima. And then on the basis of that subset that meets your target ratios across all of your liquidity constraints, so part of the great benefit of this is it allows you to evaluate them simultaneously across all of your constraints. You then just simply need to apply your funding rates to each one of your funding sources and can select whichever gives you, has the lowest cost of funds. Now, I should emphasize here that the idea is not this is robo-treasury advising. So it's going to give you a view as to what an optimal funding view looks like. But, there may be reasonable constraints that you have not considered in your optimization engine. So the idea here is you compare the output of what an optimization engine would give you versus where you're at, and try and determine how much of that gap can you close. But generally, we expect this gap to be a material amount of money. And so if we go to the next slide, we have a little bit more detail on how this process really works. So if you start in the top left of this graph, again, you have your balance sheet forecast. So you're going to have a forecast over time, and it's important to look to do this sort of an optimization over a horizon, because an optimal balance sheet for a spot point in time is not very helpful if in the next few quarters you have a lot of unsecured funding coming due or something like that. You need to have a forward-looking view of what the asset profile looks like. But you're going to also have to enrich those balance sheet forecasts on the asset side. So you're going to have to do things like, apply what is your HQLA density within each one of your businesses. So essentially, how much HQLA do you have in each one of those businesses given the balance sheet forecast? And then also things like look at your required stable funding densities across the businesses as well, and then start applying some of those factors. So once you have your assets and kind of those densities that you need to generate your ratios, you essentially have the numerator of your ratios. And then, like, if you go to the bottom left, you have to then look at, well, okay, how do I fund this? So you start with your secured, unsecured deposits and equity, and so you're going to look at different permutations of a mix between those four funding sources, but then also within that. So what is the tenor distribution within the secured funding? What's the distribution of collateral quality? So how much of it is sort of G10 government securities versus equities kind of level of liquidity to maybe some items that are less liquid but still secured funding eligible. And then similarly for your unsecured funding, what's the mix in terms of products, or CP versus bonds, and what's the tenor structure on those? And then similarly for deposits, you'd look at what's the level of deposits generated from sort of your macro outlook and any strategic initiatives, as well as your potentially different permutations of pricing strategies to evaluate the price elasticity of demand. Once you have those different mixes, you can then calculate the denominator of your liquidity ratios, as well as look at what are my net flows in my internal liquidity stress tests, and then this is the point at which you essentially have your liquidity ratios for many hundreds of thousands or millions of different permutations, and can then do the selection process. Now, one thing I would just note here is that there are some great solutions out there that can make this process very efficient. So when you have this level of granularity, you can't run a full Monte Carlo simulation because the number of permutations will be too high. But we have developed some great tools using some advanced statistical processes such as taboo search that allows you to do something similar. You can kind of think of it as a smart simulation-based approach, whereby it looks for pockets of combinations that are successful and then seeks to optimize around those. So instead of being a full Monte Carlo where every permutation is independent of all the previous that are tried, in this kind of a search process, it's a smart search process that's actually looking to search around areas where you're being successful, i.e., you're meeting your liquidity targets and like the cumulative cost of funds is coming out reasonable. And
so essentially it stops trying areas where it's obviously going to be a fail, and it just stops using the computing time and computing power and goes to where success is likely, right? Is that
that's the idea.
Yeah.
So if one permutation is you triple secured funding, it's going to quickly realize that where secured funding levels are very high, you always blow your LCR. And so it's going to stop looking at that, and it's just going to focus on the areas that actually kind of work. And that's why you can actually run this in very efficient amount of time. So it can be under an hour kind of runtime, which I think surprises people given like the number of inputs that can potentially go in. Obviously, the more granular you set it up, the more the runtime will increase with that.
So why don't we go to, we're getting toward the end here, we go to the last polling question, and then if anybody has any other questions, put them in. We do have one that we'll talk about in a second. But so this question is: how would you characterize the level of optimization in your firm's cost of funds management process? I think A, not optimized, no interest in changing our process. B, not optimized, but we are planning to optimize. C, partially optimized, but we would like to make enhancements, or D, fully optimized. So one of the, while we're waiting for the responses, one of the things that we've, there can be, certain prerequisites on anything, and one of them is really around the degree of central funding that banks have, right? And so, an imperative is that there is a central funding component or group within the firm, right? And not all firms, believe it or not, have that, right, Charles? And then that makes for very difficult discussions. So maybe you want to elaborate on that.
I mean, so especially on the sales and trading side, some desks have gone out and done some of their own funding, and that can definitely create an obstacle for this kind of a centralized funding management process. Overall, actually, when we look at all of the liquidity rules out there, what we find is that essentially some of a significant amount of the funding that the desks think they're sort of doing on their own essentially ends up needing to be funded again in unsecured, because from an LCR or NSFR standpoint, it's so punitive. And so essentially at the end of the day, like there is no point in doing it, and the businesses, they think that they deserve credit for it, but if you've created some short-dated position to go fund whatever activity, in reality you're paying for it in the Treasury anyway.
Right. And so it creates inefficiencies when you don't have that sort of central view that make it more difficult to really achieve the optimal cost of funds.
Yeah.
All right, let's see here if we've got some. Wow, so 80% partially optimized, but we'd like to make enhancements, and 20% saying not optimized, but planning to optimize. So it's clearly an area that you're all, moving down. I think that certainly, given our discussions, it's a very hot topic, and so not really too surprised at that. Although at all, I might have thought that there would be a few that were thinking they were more fully optimized, but perhaps those those folks aren't on this call. Okay, so if we have any other questions from the audience, happy to continue to answer them. But I think that looks like we've kind of touched on all the questions. The questions that we've gotten in sort of were falling into the categories of some of the things that we kind of grouped them in some of our answers that we were giving throughout. And I think that's a wrap. So we'll give everybody a minute and a half back. And thank you for joining us. We look forward to speaking to any of you who have further questions, and any other questions that we will look through the questions that came in, and any other questions that we did come in, we'll try to answer it back in writing. So thank you.